So we've got a new Hall Trials rotation here. It's Elena again, and the change is that instead of no overlapping elements, we want no overlapping classes. This is actually way better because the team slots that we have are already pretty set, right? Like every single time has always used the Cadies, we've always used Luluka, and we need a Thief as our DPS. So that's 3 classes already locked, and then the last class, for AoE, we can now use a Warrior, a Knight, there's some AUFE runs down here, a Knight, or a Ranger. And Ranger is what I opted to use this time. So I will be using Bologna. You can see there's still Straze runs, and these Straze runs are definitely better than mine. Reki's a little bit too good at this. And there's some people who haven't pushed it, like Evie's gonna blow my run out of the water later as well. So I think Straze, Abyssal Euphine, Wukong is also an option. There's some Wukong runs in here. And then, of course, Bologna is what I'm using, and there's Yuna. I don't think Yuna is better than Bologna. I think Bologna is just better because she also has the highest possible damage potential. But whichever one you have, you could just pop in Grace of Growth. And Bologna's damage potential is because of her artifact choices. So the artifact I'm using is this, Cruel Mischief, 30% extra damage. This is because my gear is kind of bad, and I need the extra damage boost. Instead of Cruel Mischief, if you have a Rengar special drink, I think even plus 15 would be good enough. You drop 3 AoEs during every single phase, so just proccing this even once or twice would be good. And then if you don't have that, anything that just boosts your damage, Dux Noctis, Cruel Mischief. There's also Bloodstone. This doesn't give you a damage boost, but it does give you healing, so if you're struggling to stay alive, could be nice for giving your runs a bit of extra sustain. But then the one that gives you the highest possible damage potential is going to be Song of Stars, because this target debuff is going to greatly increase your Violet damage during the break phase. When I tested this coming out of the first break phase, I had an extra 1 million damage. So that's a lot, and that's only going to get higher in the other 2 phases. So that's an extra, like, probably 5 million to my run, maybe 4 or 5 million. Unfortunately, I don't have the gear to use this, but it is an option. And she does have pretty high base effectiveness. She's got base 30 and 16 from her EE. Her EE does want to be the S2 -1 turn cooldown, so she can S2, S3, S2, and that'll be her 3 AoEs during the main phases. Now, of course, it's going to be hard to get enough damage plus effectiveness to hit 85, but because we no longer have to rely on Prophetic Candlestick, that big source of RNG is gone, so it's not too bad to slide in a new source of RNG. Of course, if you're not going for top 3, going through Song of Stars, just use Cruel Mischief or Drink. And then for her Molas, max S2, S3 is nice. If you're using a damage boosting artifact, you might not need to max S2, because here I hit the damage cap even in phase 3, and S3 does less damage than S2, so you could get away with some less Molas in S2. Or just toss her into Grace of Growth. If you're using her for her Rift, there's a good chance you have S2 and S3 maxed already. And her S1 Molas don't really matter, so you could save Grace of Growth for somebody else. And then we can take a look at everybody else, who's pretty much going to be the same as before. We've got Luluka. I realize now that my Luluka S3 is not maxed, which is a little bit sad because that would have been useful for trying to help kill the mobs in the 3rd phase. But not too important to max her out, but it is a bit of extra damage. You don't care about the Death Break, it's just for the damage. S2, you do want -1 turn cooldown, and then the rest of it doesn't really matter because she doesn't attack during the break phase for my setup. If she is, then S1 Molas help. For EE, I'm doing the attack down strat. Ideally 85 effectiveness, but I don't have enough because of my gear, so we're going to have to roll with 69. And the rest of the stats just into attack, crit chance, crit damage, some speed, and some HP. And of course, I'm doing Spirit's Breath as usual. This makes her S2 with 2 turn cooldown, so we can get an extra hit in during the break phase. And then we can look at Violet. Violet, same thing. He's got too much HP on this gear. He doesn't need this much. He could definitely do with less. And then I also have way too little crit chance. So POS does give 20% crit chance. But the problem is that you can't get Perception during the first phase, and POS takes time to ramp up. So I do have a little bit of RNG at the start of my run, where up until I hit 10 POS stacks, I don't have a 100% crit chance, and then I have to do some pretty tight timings in order to make it so that I always have Perception buff up. So 80 is a lot more comfy to run with, and then if you don't have POS, Cruel Mischief is a good alternative, and if you need to take Cruel Mischief from Bellona, you could give Bellona the alternatives I mentioned, like Drink, Otherworldly Machinery, Dux Noctis, whatever. And then for Violet, I just maxed all of his molas. He's a DPS. He's also a good candidate for Grace of Growth if you already have Bellona built, for example, with her S2, S3 maxed. And then lastly, we've got Cadiz, who's the same as usual. S3 for healing. I gave her the effectiveness and the attack down EE, but these don't really do anything because of my setup. And then Warhorn for damage. Instead of Warhorn, another really good option is Super Duper Water Shooter, especially for doing Song of Stars. Yes, it's a bit less damage, but it would give you a bit of extra effectiveness, so it could make your runs more consistent. And then I just gave her a bunch of speed and some HP. She doesn't have to be this fast, just use whatever works well for you. I just picked the speed and I tuned around it. And that is it for the stats, and now let's take a look at our run. Here we are with probably the final rotation for Elena, since Arceti's already been revealed to be the next Hall of Trials boss. Same as usual, we just throw all of our AoEs at her. First I check the CRs, just in case anything goes wrong. I don't actually need the CRs, it's just in case anything goes wrong, I'll have a reference. So my comp has 2 points of RNG. The first one is a need to land attack down, the third phase, with my Luluka's not 85 effectiveness as well. It doesn't matter outside of the third phase though, and the second one is my Violet's low crit rate, which only matters in the first phase. So since Violet's crit rate isn't 100%, we're going to hit the bottom mob just in case it doesn't crit it later. First up, we're going to eat Apple for a POS stack, and we might as well use our S3 on Elena. Missing crit here is only like a 30k damage loss, not really worth resetting for. And then we're going to heal up here since we didn't land any attack downs. Like I mentioned earlier, Bellona's S3 does less damage than her S2. This is only really going to come into play in the third break phase. In the first two, it'll be fine. You're still going to hit the damage cap. We're going to hit the other mob that we haven't hit yet to get the 10% on that one. And we're actually going to hit the bottom mob again with the Cadiz, just in case Violet doesn't crit it. We get the crit anyways. If Violet didn't crit there, he would do 3.2k, so we would have needed 2 Cadiz S1s to kill it, unless Cadiz crit. So now we're in the Divinity phase, we just put up our defense buff, and we start hitting Elena. So swapping back to Elena, or swapping back to Violet from Penelope, we have to play around as S2, whereas Penelope can kind of just send it. We're going to S2 for Perception, a POS stack, and Focus. And that also gives us really good rotation with our Apple. And we're going to Luluka S3 to get a stack of her S3 scaling stack. So normally we would S2 first, but since Bellona has no non-attack skills, we're actually in a 6-hit cycle instead of a 7-hit one, so we S3 first instead. We've got max focus, so we can just use our Violet S3 here. And Bellona's S2 does a little bit more damage than her S1, so we're going to S2 and then S1. You can just use Apple whenever it comes up, or depending on your setup, you can look for good timings. So our crit rate isn't maxed out yet. Which we will see here. I missed crit there. That's like a 400k, 500k damage loss, but not going to bother resetting off of it. Because I don't think my score is going to stay in the top 3. But we hit max focus here, and that's the last time we're not going to have 100% crit rate. With our POS stacked, we now have 100% crit rate throughout the run. And we S2 Luluka to give her S2 back. And then this turn, especially since my crit rate is so low, getting the apple here is really important for me because I need the 15% crit chance from the Perception. And if I eat it on this last turn, I can carry it throughout the second phase. So my second phase is really, really weird. It's pretty specific to my setup, and I wouldn't really follow this exactly unless you're doing my setup exactly. So my thing here is I'm going to try to hit Elena as little as I possibly can. I'm only going to use Bellona's AoEs, and everything else is just going to be single target. So here, instead of using Luluka's S3, I'm going to just break the skill null instead with her S1. And whichever mob got pushed up by Achates or by Elena is the one that we're going to kill first. Here we use Bellona S3. And we Violet S2, S1 into the mob that got pushed up. And since we don't need to hit Elena, we're just going to S2 ourselves so we can S3 later. That Luluka turn doesn't really matter as long as you don't hit Elena. And now we can kill the mob before it manages to hit us. And now we can heal up, which we'll need in a little bit. Violet kills off this bottom mob, and we are into the Divinity phase. But we still can't hit Elena yet, so I'm going to S2 myself. So it takes 20 hits to break Elena, and clearing the Divinity phase gives you 12. We have to hit her 4 times during the Divinity phase, so there's going to be 4 hits left total. And during the main phase, we tried to not hit her as much as we can, so we only did 3 hits. Which means that if we clear the Divinity phase here, we still have 1 hit left, which works out because there's 2 hits left for the Divinity phase here, and we need 3 people to go. We need to make sure that we break her with Luluka so that Achates will be the first person to move during the break phase. So that is why we did all of that stalling earlier. And then here we also need to eat our apple because we want the good timings on our apple rotations. And you also see that this is a very bad timing because now Elena is going to cut Luluka, but we healed up earlier, so we can just tank this S3 and everything will be fine. And now we're going to use Luluka S3 because we need 1 more stack on her S3's passive, and we didn't use it earlier during the phase. And now we have a good entry into the break phase. One risk of doing that is, since Elena gets 1 more turn than she would normally get, you do get an extra attack and speed stack on her. It doesn't seem to be too much, so it shouldn't really affect your run. And obviously, that's something that's really specific to my run, like I mentioned. If you're just doing a normal run, you're probably not going to need to do that. You can just do your AoEs, clear the break phase normally. So definitely just do it normally if you're not trying to push for a very high score. And here we give Luluka her S2 back, and we're ready to go into the third break phase. So you actually have one choice to make here. If your damage is low and you're struggling to kill the mobs in the third phase, you can actually use S1 instead of S3 here, because that way you'll have your S3 available in the third phase, and S3 does way more damage than S1, but we don't need to do that, so we'll just use our S3 here for damage instead. And this is where most of the RNG in my run is. I'm going to S1 that mob for damage just in case, not sure if I actually need it. What I do need to happen is Luluka needs to land this attack down or I am dead. This is where Super Duper Water Shooter could help out a lot, but I chose Warhorn for the extra damage, and we land the attack down anyways. And now we can start healing. With the damage in this phase and my bulks and my tunings, I don't have time for Achates to do anything except for heal, so her with her effectiveness and attack down isn't really useful. We're going to S2 ourselves so our S3 comes back up in time, and then we're going to hit the mob that Violet hit so we can do enough damage for Bellona's next S2 to kill it. And now we're going to heal up so we don't die. So here, Bellona gets to S2, and she'll be able to kill that mob on the bottom. And then Violet can S1 and kill off the mob on top. So now we're in the final Divinity phase. And this is where it gets a little bit tight because of Elena's increased speed from all of the turns she's taken and the stacks. But as usual, we're just going to hit her 4 times. And we don't have time to eat apple here, which is a little bit unfortunate. So we're just going to S1. And we're going to just barely cut ahead of her. And we still have a pretty good entry into the break phase. This team definitely has some improvements that can be made. Me missing my crit on my S1 during the first break phase and not bothering to reset for that is like a 500k damage loss. Me not being able to eat apple during the last divinity phase also means that I'm not going to have 4 focused for my final S3. I'm only going to have 1. That's another damage loss. Not sure how much, probably 500k to a million. And then me not being able to use Song of Stars because of my Bologna gear is another damage loss. And that is a damage loss from anywhere from 4 to 5 million. So my score could definitely be way higher than what I end with, but pretty satisfied with how this turned out, and this is probably my upper limit with this team anyways with my gear. And I'll let the rest of the run play out.
내 도움이 필요하지? 어떻게 처리해줄까? 자, 빼지 말고 덤벼봐. 나랑 싸운 걸 영광으로 하려고!
기다리던 순간이에요. 자, 조심하세요.
모두 구원해드릴게요. 좋아져라.
내 얼굴 말고 검을 보라고.
복수는 나의 것이다. 겨울의 친구, 우리에게 내린다.
영웅의 실력을 보여주지. 심장을 꿰뚫어주지.
그대에게 내릴 거룩한 시간. 감내하고 만끽하세요.
And so that is the Bologna team. This team, I think, works really, really well, and a lot of people will have Bologna built already for Rifts, so that's pretty nice. The Strozzi team, I might try and mess around with later, but this should be secure for top 100, so I might not. We'll see. Either way, there's definitely more options. Wukong is something that a lot of people are going to have built as well, and I think he works perfectly fine. You can use Wukong with Violet here. Here's a Wukong Violet run. Since we don't have the element limitations, you can use Wukong with Violet, so pretty much either one of your Rift DPS, whether it's Wukong or Bologna, are going to work really, really well here. Just make sure that Wukong is probably going to need a damage boosting artifact in order to kill the 3rd wave in time, because his damage mods aren't fantastic. And then I also did mention that the next rotation is probably Harsetti, because we saw it in a preview video already. So in 2 weeks, we'll get around to that, and I'll have an auto team up probably tomorrow.